I used to believe my life was perfect. Layla, my wife, and I had built a beautiful home together in a quiet, picturesque suburb. Our life seemed like the epitome of harmony, a perfect blend of shared moments, matching coffee mugs, cozy Friday movie nights, and a mutual love for gardening. Our friends and neighbors often commented on how lucky we were, how we were the perfect couple. Their words, though flattering at the time, now echo hollow in my ears. The truth is, perfection is a fragile illusion. I was blind to the cracks that had quietly formed in our relationship. The first sign of trouble, I either didn't notice or simply chose to ignore. Layla worked in marketing, a field that often required her to travel for business. I trusted her completely, as any loving husband would. Why wouldn't I? She was my partner, my confidant. I was content with my job managing a supply chain team. I admired her ambition, her energy. She was outgoing, the life of every party, while I was content to stay in the background. Our differences seemed to complement each other perfectly, or so I thought. But in the months leading up to the fateful discovery, things started to change slowly, almost imperceptibly. Layla began coming home later and later. At first, I brushed it off, telling myself it was just the demands of her work. But then, there were the subtle signs. She would cling to her phone, laughing at messages she refused to share with me. Whenever I asked, she would smile and assure me it was just work stuff or just the girls. The same response, over and over again. I wanted to believe her. I did believe her. But then, late one night, I woke up thirsty and headed to the kitchen for a glass of water. As I passed the living room, I noticed a faint glow of Layla's phone screen. It must have been left there by mistake, I thought. At first, I paid it no mind, but then curiosity crept in, gnawing at me. I knew it was wrong to pry, but it felt as though fate had guided me to this very moment. I picked up her phone, hesitated for a split second, and unlocked it. She had always trusted me with her passcode, never once suspecting that I might breach her privacy. I told myself I was only checking the messages to ensure everything was okay. But what I found shattered everything I thought I knew about her and about myself. The first message I saw was from someone named Evan. Can't stop thinking about you. Last night was amazing. My heart stopped. My hand trembled. For a moment, the world around me seemed to fade as I reread those words over and over again. Last night was amazing. What did that even mean? My mind raced, spinning in a storm of confusion. I scrolled back through their conversation, praying for an innocent explanation, but the messages only deepened my sense of betrayal. Late-night meetups, romantic emojis, inside jokes, everything I hadn't been a part of. These weren't just casual exchanges. They spoke of something deeper, something intimate that I wasn't even aware of. It wasn't just an affair. It was an emotional connection. I put the phone back exactly where I found it, my hands shaking, and stood there staring out the window. The weight of the discovery sank in slowly, a quiet storm building inside me, one that I could no longer ignore. I had questions, so many questions. Who was Evan? How long had this been going on? Why had Layla lied to me for so long? I spent hours at night sitting in the living room, replaying every moment of our marriage, trying to piece together what had gone wrong. The way she had stopped kissing me goodbye in the mornings. The new lingerie I had never seen her wear. The sudden gym memberships. The girls' nights out. All those things that never seemed out of place at the time now screamed red flags. It all made sense, but what hurt the most wasn't just the affair. It was a realization that I had been blind to it all. I had trusted her completely, given her my loyalty, and in return, she had betrayed me. When the sun rose the next morning, the initial wave of pain gave way to something darker, something more potent: anger. No, it wasn't just anger. It was a quiet, controlled fury. I wasn't just angry at Layla for betraying me. I was angry at myself for being so naive, so trusting, for being weak. Layla came downstairs that morning smiling, asking if I wanted pancakes for breakfast, completely unaware of the storm raging inside me. I looked at her then, really looked at her. The woman I had loved, the woman I had built a life with. But in that moment, I realized something chilling. She didn't see me as a threat. She thought I was harmless, easy to ignore. She had no idea what I was capable of, and that was her first mistake. Because Layla had no idea who I used to be, and I was about to remind her, revenge isn't something you rush. It takes patience, planning, and precision. I knew I needed undeniable proof, something concrete, something irrefutable, before I could confront her. I couldn't go to her with just suspicions. I needed to be sure, so I played my part. I smiled, ate the pancakes she made, kissed her on the cheek, and headed off to work. But inside, I was boiling. The image of Layla laughing with Evan was burned into my mind, but I pushed it aside. Now wasn't the time for emotions. Now was the time for action. At lunch, I contacted a private investigator, a man named Dale, who came highly recommended online. We met that evening at a coffee shop, and I laid everything out. I told him my suspicions, that my wife was having an affair, and that I needed proof. Photos, text, locations, anything that would confirm what I feared. Dale, with a sly grin, assured me, "Discreet is my middle name. You'll have what you need in no time." The next few days felt like an eternity. Layla went about her usual routine, laughing, chatting, even mentioning a business trip she had planned for the weekend. My stomach churned as she casually spoke about leaving town, knowing full well she was probably going to meet Evan. But still, I didn't confront her. Not yet. 3 days later, Dale called. "Jack, you were right," he said, his voice grim. "I've got everything. Photos, timestamps, the whole shebang." I met him that evening in his office, and what he showed me left me cold. There were photos of Layla walking into a fancy downtown hotel with Evan, screenshots of their text conversations, details of their planned weekend getaway. It wasn't just a casual affair. This was something deeper, something that had been brewing for a long time. As I stared at the evidence, something inside me shifted. My sadness, my heartbreak, started to fade. I didn't cry. I didn't yell. I didn't feel the need to lash out. No. Instead, I began to think, every betrayal deserves consequences. And I was going to make sure that Layla and Evan faced theirs. Layla had no idea what she had set in motion. The plan I had carefully constructed was now in its final stages, and she was completely oblivious to the storm about to engulf her. Her life, which she thought she had control over, was unraveling before her eyes. And the best part, she still thought I was the same harmless man. The days following her business trip blurred together like a bad dream. I watched her scramble to save the fragments of the life she had so recklessly shattered. What she hadn't yet realized was that everything she had built, her career, her social circle, her so-called perfect marriage, was crumbling, all due to her own choices. I, on the other hand, was calm, collected, and focused. For the first time in a long while, I felt in control. No longer was I the naive man who blindly trusted. No longer was I the fool. The old Jack had disappeared, and in his place stood someone cold, sharp, and determined. I was about to make sure those who had wronged me would pay. The first few days after Leah returned were filled with tense silence. Desperate to salvage her reputation, she threw herself into damage control, but every effort was in vain. The cracks in her facade grew larger, becoming more evident to those around her. One evening, she came home from work looking pale, her usual confidence replaced by a nervous energy that I found almost amusing. She barely spoke to me, her mind clearly consumed by the wreckage she had made of her life. "Jack," she finally said, breaking the silence, "I'm really scared. Things at work are getting worse. HR is investigating the allegations. People are talking. I don't know how much longer I can keep this up. I studied her carefully, taking in every word, every gesture. She was terrified, no doubt about it. But what struck me most was how she still hadn't connected the dots. She didn't know that it was me, her once trusting husband, who had orchestrated everything. The anonymous tip to HR, the photos, the texts. She thought someone else was trying to ruin her life. The truth, however, was far simpler. It was her own actions that had led to this collapse. "You'll get through this, Leah," I said calmly, my voice barely above a whisper. "It's just a misunderstanding. Everything will work itself out." She looked at me, her eyes filled with desperation, but there was now a flicker of doubt in them. She wasn't so sure anymore, and that, for me, was the sweet taste of victory. It wasn't just about exposing her infidelity anymore. It was about watching her unravel, piece by piece, as she realized the full extent of her actions. But I wasn't done yet. The next part of my plan was to make Evan pay. He was the man who had waltzed into my life, thinking he could take what was mine. I already knew everything about him. His gambling problem, his debts, his shady business dealings. I could have gone after him directly, but I wanted him to suffer without ever knowing who was behind it all. So, I made a few discreet calls. I contacted some of his more unsavory creditors and let them know about his recent activities. I didn't need to threaten him directly. I knew the pressure from his past would do the work for me. It didn't take long before Evan began to feel the heat. I saw the changes in him when Leah spoke about him, how she was so concerned, so worried. His gambling debts were eating away at him. The calls, the threats, the visits from creditors were taking their toll. But what made it even more delicious was knowing that Leah was starting to question whether Evan was even worth all the trouble. One night, she came home more frazzled than before, her face pale and haggard. "Jack, I need to talk to you," she said, pacing the living room. "Evan's in trouble. People are after him. He's getting these calls, these threats. It's bad, Jack. Really bad." I could barely keep the smirk off my face. It was almost too easy. She was caught between the fallout from her affair and the mess at work, and she still hadn't figured out the truth. "Do you think he'll be okay?" I asked, feigning concern, though inside I was savoring her misery. "I don't know," she replied, shaking her head. "Everything's falling apart. My job, my relationship with Evan. I just don't know what to do anymore." That's when I knew I had her exactly where I wanted her. She had no idea that I was the one pulling all the strings. She had no clue that I had methodically planned her destruction. And the worst part, she still thought she was a victim. But I wasn't finished. The final blow, the one that would bring her to her knees, was exposure, public exposure. Leah thrived on her image, her career, her friendships, her social status. These were the things that defined her. And I knew that if I could strip all of that away, she'd be left with nothing. I created an anonymous email account and carefully crafted a message. The subject line was simple: "You deserve to know the truth." In the body, I attached the photos of Leah and Evan along with excerpts from their text messages. I hit send. It didn't take long for the email to circulate. Within hours, Lee's phone started buzzing incessantly. Her friends texted, questioning her, accusing her. Her mother called, crying, demanding answers. Whispers spread like wildfire, and Leah, for the first time, was powerless. That evening, she confronted me, her face flushed with anger and humiliation. "Did you do this?" she demanded, her voice shaking. "Did you send those photos? Did you ruin my life?" I stood there, calm as ever, looking her straight in the eye. "Why would I do that, Leah?" I asked, my voice low and steady. "I didn't even know you were seeing someone else." Her eyes widened, and for the first time, I saw a genuine fear in them. She had finally realized the truth. The walls came crashing down, and there was no way to undo the damage. "I can explain," she said, her voice pleading. "I made a mistake, Jack. A huge mistake." I shook my head, cutting her off. No, Leah, you made a choice. And now you're dealing with the consequences. Her sobs filled the room as she collapsed onto the couch, burying her face in her hands. But it was too late. There was no redemption, no forgiveness. Lee's life continued to spiral out of control. Her company fired her, citing ethical violations. Evan vanished, unable to face the wreckage he had helped create. Her friends, who once adored her, began distancing themselves, unwilling to associate with her scandal. Leah had no one left to turn to. At home, she barely spoke. The vibrant energy she once had was gone, replaced by a hollow shell of the woman I had once loved. She moved through the house like a ghost, haunted by the consequences of her own decisions. And I couldn't care less. The final act was a divorce, but not just any divorce. I wasn't going to let her get away with anything. She had taken everything from me, and now it was time to take it all back. My lawyer, Lauren, made sure every detail was handled. Financial settlements, custody arrangements, everything was set in my favor. Leah wouldn't see a dime. I walked into the lawyer's office and signed the papers. It was done. Leah never saw it coming. She thought she had all the power, all the control, but in the end, I had the last word. As I walked away from the wreckage of our marriage, I knew I had learned an invaluable lesson. Never, ever underestimate a man who has nothing left to lose. Watching Leah struggle to hold her life together was oddly satisfying. The person who once had everything now seemed to be unraveling before my eyes. And I couldn't help but feel a sense of justice. She spent hours on the phone, desperately trying to patch things up, scrambling to fix the mess she had made. But it was too late. The storm I had unleashed had already torn her world apart. The once pristine and composed Layla I had known had now been reduced to a pale shadow of herself. The cracks in her perfect world had become glaringly obvious, impossible to ignore. Her hair, which had always been perfectly styled, now lay tangled and unkempt, a reflection of the unraveling facade she had spent years maintaining. Her makeup, once immaculate, had smudged under the weight of her stress, and the clothes she once wore with pride now hung on her frame like the remnants of a life that was falling apart. One evening, as I watched her sit at the kitchen table, staring blankly at her phone, I knew the time had come. This was a moment I had meticulously planned for months. I had prepared myself for this, and now I was ready. Without uttering a word, I slid the divorce papers across the table. The sharp sound of the papers scraping against the wood seemed to echo in the silence. Her eyes widened in disbelief as she looked up at me. There was a mixture of confusion and shock in her gaze. What is this?" she stammered, picking up the papers in trembling hands. "Divorce papers," I said, my voice colder than I had ever intended. "It's over, Layla." She scanned the papers as though she couldn't comprehend what she was reading, her face contorting with disbelief. "You can't be serious," she pleaded, her voice breaking. "Jack, please, can we talk about this?" I remained steadfast, my tone unwavering. "There's nothing to talk about. You made your choices. Now, you have to live with them." Tears welled in her eyes and streamed down her face, but I felt no sympathy, no anger, and certainly no bitterness. There was only a hollow emptiness, a sense of finality. Layla wasn't crying because she regretted what she had done to me. She was crying because she was losing everything: her marriage, her comfortable life, her illusion of control. The divorce process itself was swift, a carefully orchestrated effort that left Layla with nearly nothing. With the help of Lauren, my trusted lawyer, I ensured that every financial asset we shared was transferred to my name untouchable. I used the damning evidence of her affair to secure everything: our house, our savings, and every other asset that had once been shared between us. Layla, meanwhile, sank further into her own chaos. The debts she had accumulated from her reckless actions were staggering, and her unemployment benefits barely covered her basic expenses. The scandal had made it nearly impossible for her to find a job in her field. Meanwhile, Evan, the man she had sacrificed everything for, had disappeared. No one knew where he had gone, but I had a good idea. He was likely hiding from the creditors I had tipped off. Layla tried calling him, but each time, she was met with nothing but silence. The man she had once believed would be her salvation had abandoned her, leaving her to face the fallout alone. By the time the divorce was finalized, Layla's life was a far cry from the one she had once known. She had been forced to move into a dingy one-bedroom apartment on the outskirts of town, a far cry from the luxurious life she had once enjoyed. Her social media accounts, once filled with photos of exotic vacations and glamorous parties, were now silent. Her friends had vanished, and even her family kept their distance. The whispers behind her back were louder than ever, and I couldn't help but take a twisted satisfaction in knowing that people now saw her for what she truly was. Then, one day, out of nowhere, Layla showed up at my doorstep. Her face was gaunt, her eyes red from crying, and she looked like a completely different person. The woman who once had everything was now a shell of her former self. "Jack," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I'm sorry for everything. I know I messed up. I know I hurt you, but please, can we try again? I'll do anything." I stood there, emotionless, gazing at her. For the first time in months, I didn't feel anger. I didn't feel pity. I didn't feel anything. The woman standing before me was not the Layla I had married. That woman had been replaced by someone who had betrayed me, lied to me, and assumed she could get away with it. I shook my head slowly. "No, Layla," I said, my voice firm and unwavering. "I'm done. You made sure of that." She collapsed onto the porch, sobbing uncontrollably, but I didn't let her inside. I closed the door gently behind me, leaving her with nothing but the remnants of her broken heart and shattered dreams. And as I walked away, I didn't look back. I knew, without a doubt, that I had made the right decision. Layla had underestimated me. She had assumed I was too weak, too naive, to stand up for myself. But I had proven her wrong. I had shown her that even the kindest people have limits. And when those limits are crossed, there's no telling what they're capable of. In the weeks that followed, I began rebuilding my life. The house that had once been filled with the noise and chaos of our marriage was now silent. For the first time in years, I could hear myself think. The emptiness that had once consumed me was slowly replaced by a sense of peace. I started rediscovering parts of myself I had forgotten. My love for music, my interest in woodworking, my desire to live life on my own terms. I wasn't just surviving anymore. I was living, and it felt incredible. Meanwhile, Layla's life continued to unravel. The stories of her downfall spread like wildfire. People whispered about the woman who had once had everything, but had lost it all. I didn't keep tabs on her, but the rumors kept coming. She was struggling to make ends meet, unable to find a job in her field, living in a small, cramped apartment all alone. The pain she had inflicted upon me was now something she lived with every single day. One day, I received a letter. It was from Layla. I hadn't expected to hear from her again, but there it was, sitting in my mailbox. I opened it and read her words twice before folding it and placing it in a drawer. "Jack," the letter began, "I know I'm the last person you want to hear from, but I need to say this. I'm sorry, not just for the affair, but for taking you for granted. You were a good husband, and I threw it all away for something meaningless. I know I can't undo the damage I've caused, but I hope one day you can forgive me. I didn't feel anger. I didn't feel satisfaction. I didn't even feel relief. What I felt was acceptance." Layla's apology didn't change anything. It didn't erase the pain, the betrayal, or the months of suffering. But it was the closest thing to closure I was ever going to get. I folded the letter and placed it in the drawer, locking away that chapter of my life for good. As the months passed, I began planning my departure from the town. It wasn't that I hated the place. It was just that it was filled with too many memories, good ones, bad ones, and everything in between. I needed to leave to start fresh, far away from the ghosts of the past. With the assets I had secured in the divorce, I had the freedom to go wherever I wanted. I chose a small town in the Pacific Northwest, a place I had always dreamed of living. The air was crisp, the landscape serene, and for the first time in years, I felt at peace. I found work at a local hardware store, started volunteering at a community center, and even adopted a dog. It wasn't glamorous, but it was mine. It was real. Occasionally, I thought about Layla. I wondered if she would ever find her way back to happiness, or if the choices she had made would haunt her forever. But I didn't dwell on it. My life was no longer tied to hers, and that in itself was liberating. Looking back, I didn't regret what I had done. Layla had underestimated me. She had assumed I was too weak, too naive, to stand up for myself. But I had proven her wrong. Even the kindest people have limits. And when those limits are crossed, there's no telling what they're capable of.